Did you know that Manhattan means place of drunkenness? Or that Babe Ruth once led the league in pitching? Or how about that Queen Elizabeth was once King of France? And that King Arthur was never really a king at all? For answers to these and many more strange, unusual facts, this week's episode, and probably next week's as well, we're going to dive into this comic book I found in the archives. It's pretty damaged, but preserved just enough to scan in and read the stories. Blue Star Publishing, it looks like, published what's probably John Hicks's second book. It must have been about 1931. All the kind of best of the comic strips of 1930 and 31 were captured here in this comic book, and we'll dive in right here at Strange As It Seems. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. So we'll dive into this week's episode, which is this kind of amazing comic book I found. I need to find some more of these, hopefully in better condition. This was just good enough in terms of being able to peel the pages off and scan them in, but really an amazing comic book here. The first fact on the front was, it takes a plane longer to fly across the city of Honolulu than from Mexico to Canada. How about that for a fact? But I love some of the quotes here in the foreword from John Hicks. A lot of times it gives me a better sense of who my family is by some of the words they wrote in forewords to their books. Which are the stranger? Nature's own inventions, or those of man whom she lets live? A question I often ask myself. I leave the answer to you. In this book, there are more than 250 strange things from throughout the world and down through the ages depicted. History, science, sports, geology, biology. Read them and determine, if you can, which are stranger, nature's own inventions or those of man whom she lets live. Let's kick off today's episode in the wild world of sports. Lots of sports facts in this book. First of which, here on page 5, in a game between Toledo and Milwaukee, check this out, 9 double plays were made. No two were alike, crazy enough. This was on May 2nd, 1931. I featured this one before, but it cracks me up. This Walker family was an incredible family, but I actually have the paper, the newspaper that this was drawn from. But Sonny Walker, age 7, from Phoenix, Arizona, he carried Babe Ruth, who was 220 pounds, on his shoulders. This is from 1923. And speaking of Babe Ruth, here's another drawing of Babe Ruth on page 23, but apparently he led the American League in pitching. People didn't know that he was a pitcher as well as a hitter, kind of like today's Shohei Ohtani from the Dodgers. But he led the American League in pitching back in 1915. And here's one of Jack Broughton, great boxing champion from 100 years ago. But he was champion of the world for 16 years, Jack Broughton. And another amazing boxing story on page 17, Frank Bartley. He was a Chicago lightweight, although completely knocked out by Shorty Ahern, was still declared the winner. Crazy. And here's another amazing athlete my family loved to feature, extraordinary handicapped athletes. And here's Lupe Zarate. Although armless, he's a regular on the McAllen, Texas high school football team. His blocking and tackling feature every game. Wow, Lupe Zarate. And check this one out. Features my alma mater, SMU. With SMU on the 4-yard line, George Lord from the Texas Aggies made 4 consecutive tackles himself, preventing a touchdown. George Lord from the Texas Aggies. And another amazing tackler, Herb Stein of Pittsburgh, made 11 consecutive tackles versus Syracuse. Herb Stein. And a couple from the world of golf to wrap this up. Here's a golfer on the number 2 tee. Apparently he drove a ball into the overalls pocket of McKinley Nelson, who was on the number 3 hole. This is in Contra Costa Country Club in California. And how about this athlete? Billy Freeze Jr. made a 90-yard drive. Doesn't sound too impressive until you realize he's 19 months old. Oakland, California, 1925. All right, let's pivot over to history. How about Benjamin Franklin? It's a coincidence. He was the youngest son of the youngest son of the youngest son of the youngest son, Benjamin Franklin. Here's an amazing character from history. How about Jeffrey Hudson? He's 1.5 feet tall, killed a man 4 times his own height in a duel. This is all the way back to the 17th century in England. Well, here's an unfortunate guy from history, Bajazet the First. He was Sultan of the Ottoman Turks back in 1389. Was chained in a cage like a wild beast and compelled to accompany the army of Tamerlane, his conqueror. And another figure from history I hadn't heard of, Thomas Cochrane, who was the 10th Earl of Dundonald, was an admiral of 4 different navies and refused a 5th. I found a couple more from the sports realm. These are amazing. How about this one? I don't know how this happened. There were no points scored, no shots at either basket, no fouls, no out of bounds, no held balls, no timeout, and no substitution in the first half of a basketball game between Shenandoah and Clarinda, Iowa high schools back in 1932. Definitely does not seem like a titanic struggle between 2 great opposing forces there. And then I got this one too. I love this. Bobby Jones, the great Bobby Jones, golfer, made 9 birdies and 9 pars in 1 round at Eastlake, Atlanta. I've been there several times. Eastlake Country Club, 1922. And a bunch of these, I call these myth conceptions. These are some of my favorite things from Strange as It Seems, and probably had packed in most of the wow of the comic strip back in the day. I know that John Hicks led with this when he was selling subscriptions and publications. And my favorite group of facts, I like to call these myth conceptions. This was probably the signature of Strange as It Seems back in the day, just facts that would spin your head around, think, what? Kind of the opposite of what you thought you knew. And here's a whole page of them on page 29, titled, Can You Beat It? The onion is a lily. How's that? Butterflies taste with their feet. A penny is worth 2 cents. How about that? Black ink is made from white mushrooms, and an angleworm has more feet than a 1,000-leg millipede. Crazy. Amazing stories here from the page 29. But what I called myth conceptions, my great uncle John Hicks called whatnots. And here's on page 11, a bunch of them as well. The horned toad is not a toad, and a lead pencil does not contain lead. Football is not a pigskin, it's a cowhide. Firefly is not a fly. Tin cans are not tin. Ice cream is not cooling, it actually makes you hotter. How about that? The Irish potato isn't Irish. Peanut, it's not a nut. Flying fish don't fly. Banana oil is not made from bananas, and the spider is not an insect. Amazing. All those whatnots, or as I call them, myth conceptions from Strange as It Seems. And a few more of those myth conceptions spread out in the comic book. Have you ever heard the old expression horse feathers, right? I don't know old movies if you've ever come across that, but horse feathers is not simply a slang expression. Apparently horses really do have feathers. And the Bunker Hill Monument, Charlestown, Massachusetts, commemorates a battle that was never fought. How about that? I don't have the proof of all of these because this is the comic book. Usually I'm telling stories with the proof, but that's one I'm going to have to dig up. Pretty amazing fact there. And I'm sure there's a little twist, as there usually is. But if I come across the fact, I'll put it down in the comments below. And my favorite myth conception of all, in this book anyway, this actually influenced me quite a bit when I was a kid. I ended up studying this subject at school at SMU, and even went to Oxford for a semester abroad to study it even in more depth. But King Arthur is not a king. Great drawing here of King Arthur, and amazing mythology behind King Arthur that I could go on and on, but won't here. And another group of facts that I just like to think of as anecdotes that are sprinkled out through all the Strange as It Seems comic strips. And here's one, a short story about the last of $100,000 fortune spent on wine, women, and song that was found typed on a $1 bill in Durant, Oklahoma. Or how about this? On page 47, there's the fact that one cigar contains enough nicotine to kill 4 men. 4 pages earlier, check out Billy Wattler. 4 years old, apparently smokes 15 big, strong cigars every day. Billy Wattler in St. Louis, Missouri. And here's a story that deserves a little more research. I might tell a broader version of this at some point, but how about this one? With a gun constructed of breadcrumbs, an Italian prisoner held up his guard and escaped. Amazing. Ever hear the expression, mind your P's and Q's? Your grandparents ever tell you that? Or great-grandparents? Apparently, mind your P's and Q's comes from mind your pints and quarts. And here's one I mentioned at the top of the hour. Seems appropriate. A few times I've been to New York City, but Manhattan apparently means place of drunkenness. And how about this? How quaint does this seem in this day and age? But apparently, John D. Rockefeller was the first man to ever make $1 billion. Wow, a billionaire. Seems incredible back in the day, huh? And now we have our first trillionaire with Elon Musk. But there's also one here at the top that there are more automobiles than in the U.S., than bathrooms or telephones, and more people use cars than toothbrushes here in the early 1930s. And how about this? A 1903 I-cylinder Cadillac was driven 700 miles across country after it had been submerged in a creek for 8 years. That's the old, they don't make them like they used to, huh? A pretty cool story here of Harold Marks. He was in San Quentin for robbery, and he overheard comments of lock-picking experts, then devised a pick-proof lock, which he then sold for $100,000. Wow, Harold Marks. And for the final story from the Blue Star comic book, from John Hicks from the early 1930s. This is a story that I actually pulled out about 12, 13 years ago and did a few episodes. It's a series I called Animated Comics. I think I'm going to get back to doing more of those. But this is the story of the luckiest man on earth. And actually, if you look below under Animated Comics, you'll see the luckiest man alive. But this is the story of Captain Headley of Chicago. He was thrown out of a plane at an altitude of like 15,000 feet. He fell several hundred feet and landed safely on the tail of the same airplane. For more of that, check out the episode below. This was back in 1918. Well, that wraps up this week. Stories from the early 1930s, kind of a greatest hits compendium that was compiled in this Strange as It Seems comic book from 1931, Blue Star Publishing. Kind of a waterlogged. Glad we were able to grab that and preserve it before it completely disintegrated. But if you like content like this, stories of the strange and unusual, archived comics from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. I also have some of the classics, radio shows and early film shorts from the 1930s and 40s below. Check out the content here, and I'll wrap with, as I usually do, with the foreword from John Hicks's first book back in 1928, in which he basically launched Strange as It Seems as a library of the curious in nature and humankind, launched on the vast sea of public opinion with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live.